Chemical plants. There's always the question, is there any way, any chance, any percentage of actually stopping the actual manufacturing of methamphetamine? And the answer is yes. Yes, there is an actual solution, but there's too much money to be made, and there's too much at risk for chemical plants to actual to exist, to exist straight out. Um, we've regulated so much here in the United States that we've had to outsource our actual chemical development to basically third world countries. And third world countries are going to be more vulnerable to corruption than a legitimate, prosperous chemical producing company. That's just the way it is. There's less regulatory, there's less actual bureaucracy involved in the manufacturing of such chemicals that it's impossible to actually produce certain recipes, certain chemicals in the U.S. just for the fact of the EPA. And I'm not saying EPA is a bad thing. It does do a lot of good. As frustrating as it would get sometimes at the port or at the border, at the actual at the beach, um, there needed to be some kind of actual authority at some point. But with that being said, the DEA in the late 70s, they were dealing with the actual kind of a, I guess, an epidemic too with Quaaludes. And Quaaludes would get you almost like a Valium, I should say, a Valium, a downer. And I've never even, I've never seen an actual pill or I've never seen anybody on it. But supposedly it was very, very addicting. And from what I gathered, the DEA was actually successful in eliminating the actual production of the main ingredient, the main chemical in the United States. So therefore, it was being produced, like I said, in other countries, third world countries. They were actually supplying that ingredient to Colombians, and they were turning around and making pills out of them. Therefore, shipping them to the U.S., the black market, and being very, very profitable. So what the DA did, they went around to the countries that actually developed this such chemical and straight out asked the countries to stop producing it, which they did. So the Colombians had no longer the ability to make them quaalude pills. Therefore, they actually, the DEA actually won that battle. And but of course, something else takes its place. But I mean, they've actually eradicated that actual type of actual dope. So when the U.S. actually started regulating the what is it called what is it called the textual, I had it right here on the top of my head. I can't say why I can't say ephedrine. There you go, ephedrine. So when they started regulating that, and they started to really go after the companies that were actually manufacturing this and just selling them to uh, private companies, and when we actually uh, stopped selling these actual pills, like the sinus pills, over the or just with no prescription, you actually have to ask the pharmacist for it. You don't need a prescription, but you have to ask the pharmacist for it, and they get dispense like two um, to an individual, and they'll actually document your name, you know. And so it made it a little bit more hard to actually make this pills readily available. So they made it a little bit harder. So when the actual when the actual bikers in California started feeling the pressure, and they really started actually hitting these actual motorcycle clubs up, and they started putting a lot of pressure on these clubs. So they handed it off to to the Mexicans, and they showed the Mexicans how to actually make meth and exactly what ingredients they needed it, and they turned around and found an actual resource outside of the continent, you know. And for that being said, this particular group of brothers, the Amezcuas, they actually had a plug from actual India, and in India they were getting it by the ton. They were getting it by the ton and disguised as different imports into actual Mexico. So the DA had no idea how these actual groups were actually coming up with such actual chemicals and who was producing the chemicals at that scale, you know, by the ton, you know. And so when they had no answer, they were kind of, you know, they were lost. They were lost. They were actually lost, and with actually with with them only catching the finished product, it was even worse because they didn't know who was actually supplying these ingredients, right? And not even knowing that these brothers actually had the plug straight to actual India until one of their shipments came in through actual Texas, and there was a minor layover, and they were actually I believe that they were being transferred from one plane to another to be shipped to Mexico. So it was en route is how they caught it. And I don't know if somebody was just nosy, they opened up a box or a box popped open. And anyway, so they ended up accidentally catching a break and actually putting two and two together, and they actually came up with the actual with these brothers and how these brothers were actually producing it. They were actually producing it up in I think in the Central Valley of California, in these rural farm areas, you know, and basically in these old farmhouses, they were actually making these actual batches by the pound. You know what I mean? So, but along with that, accidents happen and explosions happen. You know, and but you know, trial and error. And so when they actually pinpointed the actual manufacturers, that's when they started really, really hampering down on these actual uh, little little labs, you know, little labs in these actual agriculture fields. And so when they suppress this actual community, uh, you know, there's other sources that are actually going to pop up. They're going to actually exist. So they were still being produced in out of Mexico now, and there are certain states that were actually really, really dedicate themselves to these type of actual synthetic drugs. So one way that they still use this method actually is since you can't bring it in by the actual ton any longer like you used to be able to just ship that stuff in from Hong Kong, from China into Mexico by the barrel, and it wasn't all going to the pharmacies. And the pharmacies were, you know, it was all tied together, so they were just, you know, breaking off their portions to the cartels, and they were just producing methamphetamine by the ton. And one way that they actually, and I know that they still exist, are buried batches. They made so much that it was so much quantity that they needed to actually bury this actual meth for future sales. There was that much going on. So there are still ranches out in agriculture areas with buried meth that I'm still sure that they're actually siphoning in little by little their reserves, you know. And so when they actually started cutting down with all these actual big pharmaceutical companies producing these plants producing these actual chemicals, what they do is when they actually come across Asian actual nationals with cartels, they're not necessarily part of a cartel. They're not necessarily part of the actual violence, the actual muscle, the actual affiliation. No, no, no. What they'll do is that they will actually send a representative from either China or Hong Kong that's able to translate on land to ships in the ocean passing through Mexican waters. So the cartels will have these actual pangas, these actual swifts ready, fueled up to actually go intercept actual bundles of chemicals of for to make meth to for fentanyl. They'll actually throw on the ocean on floaters, and the cartels will know exactly where to go and retrieve these by the help of these actual Asian translators. So they'll communicate with with the cargo ship and actual code, and they'll actually come to the actual conclusion that there's so many bundles of actual chemicals, barrels in a certain area in the ocean, and the cartel will go retrieve them, bring it back on land, and actually produce the dope. And that being said, um, as old and as low tech as this sounds, the actual Navy actual has ships that are floating in the actual ocean, all lights out, no noise, just eavesdropping on communication with ship build with actual fishing vessels, cargo vessels, just to intercept some kind of clue to any kind of actual smuggling or aiding and abetting actual producing any kind of actual uh, illegal activity in the waters. Therefore, they don't know they're talking freely on the actual in the channel. They're actually being listened by an actual vessel, and they'll get they'll interdict that actual cargo or the actual ship that's being tossed over the side of the actual boat. That's how things work, you know. And this again has to give you a little different actual narratives of actually how they get these chemicals into actual Mexico for production. Okay, guys, don't forget to like and subscribe.